Chapter 3. I figure she should take care of herself, put herself in the deep freeze, and in a year or two, in all likelihood, they'll develop a pill that'll clear this up, simple as a common cold. Already, some of these cortisones, but the doctor tells us they don't know but what the side effects may be worse. The big C. My figuring is take the chance. They're just about ready to lick cancer anyways. And with these transplants, pretty soon they can replace your whole insides. Mr. Angstrom Sr. in John Updike's Rabbit Redo, 1971. Updike's novel was set in what might be called the optimistic years of the Nixon administration, the time of the Apollo mission and the birth of that all-American can-do expression that begins, if we can put a man on the moon, end quotation. In January 1971, Senators Kennedy and Javits sponsored the Conquest of Cancer Act, and by December of that year, Richard Nixon had signed something like it into law, allowing, along with huge federal appropriations. The talk was all of a war on cancer. 4 decades later, those other glorious wars on poverty and drugs and terror combine to mock such rhetoric, and as often as I am encouraged to battle my own tumor, I can't shake that feeling that it is the cancer that is making war on me. The dread with which it is discussed, the big C, is still almost superstitious. So is the ever whispered hope of a new treatment or cure. In her famous essay on Hollywood, Pauline Kael described it as a place where you could die in of encouragement. That may still be true of Tinseltown. In Tumortown, you sometimes feel that you may expire from sheer advice. A lot of it comes free and unsolicited. I must, without delay, begin ingesting the granulated essence of the peach pit. Or is it the apricot? A sovereign remedy known to ancient civilizations but now covered up by greedy modern doctors. Another correspondent urges heaping doses of testosterone supplements, perhaps a morale booster. Or I must find ways of opening certain chakras and putting myself in an appropriately receptive mental state. Macrobiotics or vegan diets will be all I require for nourishment during this experience. And don't laugh at poor old Mr. Angstrom's above. Somebody has written it to me from a famous university to suggest that I have myself cryonically or cryogenically frozen against the day when the magic bullet or whatever it is has been devised. When I failed to reply to this, I got a second missive suggesting that I freeze at least my brain so that its cortex could be appreciated by posterity. Well, I mean to say, gosh, thanks awfully. As against all that, I did get a kind of note from a Cheyenne Arapaho friend of mine saying that everyone she knew who had resorted to tribal remedies had died almost immediately, and suggesting that if I was offered any Native American medicines, I should move as fast as possible in the opposite direction. Some advice can actually be taken. Even in the world of sanity and modernity, though it often cannot. Extremely well-informed people also get in touch to insist that there is really only one doctor or only one clinic. These physicians and facilities are as part as Cleveland and Kyoto. Even if I had possession of my own aircraft, I would never be able to assure myself that I had tried every one, let alone everything. The citizens of Tumortown are forever assailed with cures and rumors of cures. I actually did take myself to one grand palazzo of a clinic in the richer part of this stricken city, which I will not name because all I got from it was a long and dull exposition of what I already knew, plus, while laying on one of the fabled establishment's examination tables, a bug bite that briefly doubled the size of my left hand. Completely surplus even to my precancerous requirements, but a real irritation to someone with a chemically corroded immune system. Still and all, this is both an exhilarating and a melancholy time to have a cancer like mine. Exhilarating because my calm and scholarly oncologist, Dr. Frederick Smith, can design a chemo cocktail that has already shrunk some of my secondary tumors and can tweak said cocktail to minimize certain nasty side effects. That wouldn't have been possible when Updike was writing his book or when Nixon was proclaiming his war, but melancholy too, because new peaks of medicine are rising and new treatments beginning to be glimpsed, and they have probably come too late for me. For example, I was encouraged to learn of a new immunotherapy protocol developed by Dr. Steven Rosenberg and Nicholas Restifo at the National Cancer Institute. Actually, the word encouraged is an understatement. I was hugely excited. It is now possible to remove T cells from the blood, subject them to a process of genetic engineering, and then re-inject them to attack the malignancy. Some of this may sound like a space-age medicine, wrote Dr. Restifo, as if he, too, had been rereading Updike. But we have treated well over 100 patients with genetically engineered T cells and have treated over 20 patients with the exact approach that I am suggesting may be applicable to your case. There was a catch, and it involved a match. My tumor had to express a protein called NYESO1, and my immune cells had to have a particular molecule named HLA-A2. Given this pairing, the immune system could be charged up to resist the tumor. The odds looked good in that half of those with the European or Caucasian genes do have that very molecule. And my tumor, when analyzed, did have that protein. But my immune cells declined to identify as sufficiently Caucasian. Other similar trials are under review by the Food and Drug Administration, but I am in a bit of a hurry, and I can't forget the feeling of flatness that I experienced when I received the news. Best perhaps to get these false hopes behind one quickly. It was in the same week that I was told that I didn't have the necessary mutations in my tumor to qualify for any other of the targeted cancer therapies currently on offer. A night or so later, I was emailed by perhaps 50 friends because 60 Minutes had run a segment about the tissue engineering by way of stem cells of a man with a cancerous esophagus. He had effectively been medically enabled to grow a new one. I excitedly contacted my friend Dr. Collins, father of genome-based treatment, who gently but firmly told me that my cancer had spread too far beyond my esophagus to be treatable by such a means. Analyzing the blues that I developed during those lousy 7 days, I discovered that I felt cheated as well as disappointed. Until you have done something for humanity, wrote the great American educator Horace Mann, you should be ashamed to die. I would have happily offered myself as an experimental subject for new drugs or new surgeries, partly, of course, in the hope that they might salvage me, but also on the man principle. And I didn't even qualify for the adventure. So I have to trudge on with the chemo routine, augmented if it proves worthwhile by radiation, and perhaps the much discussed cyberknife for a surgical intervention. Both of these things near miraculous when compared with the recent past. There is an even longer shot that I do propose to attempt, even though its likely efficacy lies at the outer limits of probability. I'm going to try to have my entire DNA sequenced along with the genome of my tumor. Francis Collins was typically sober in his evaluation of the usefulness of this. If the two sequencings could be performed, he wrote to me, it could be clearly determined what mutations were present in the cancer that is causing it to grow. The potential for discovering mutations in the cancer cells that could lead to a new therapeutic idea is uncertain. This is at the very frontier of cancer research right now. Partly for that reason, as he advised me, the cost of having it done is also very steep at the moment. But to judge by my correspondence, practically everybody in this country has either had cancer or has a friend or relative who has been a victim of it. So perhaps I will be able to contribute a little bit to enlarging the knowledge that will help future generations. I say perhaps, partly because Francis has now had to lay aside a lot of his pioneering work in order to defend his profession from legal blockade of its most promising avenue of endeavor. Even as he and I were having those partly thrilling and partly lowering conversations, Last August, a federal judge in Washington, D.C. ordered a halt to all government expenditure on embryonic stem cell research. Judge Royce Lamberth was responding to a suit from supporters of the so-called Dickey-Wicker Amendment, named for the Republican duo who in 1995 managed to forbid federal spending on any research that employs a human embryo. As a believing Christian, Francis is squeamish about creation for research purposes, for the creation of for research purposes of those non-sentient celled clumps, as if you care, am I? But he was hoping for good work to result from those use already existing embryos, originally creating for in vitro fertilization. These embryos are going nowhere as it is, but now religious maniacs strive to forbid even their use, which would help what the same maniacs regard as the unformed embryos fellow humans. The politicized sponsors of this pseudoscientific nonsense should be ashamed to live, let alone die. If you want to take part in the war against cancer and other terrible maladies, too, then join the battle against their lethal stupidity. End of chapter. Chapter 4. Ever since I was felled in mid-book tour in the summer of 2010, I have adored and seized all chances to play catch-up and to keep as many engagements as I can. Debating and lecturing are part of the breath of life to me, and I take deep drafts whenever and wherever possible. I also truly enjoy the FaceTime with you, dear reader, whether or not you bring a receipt for a shiny new copy of my memoirs. But here is what happened a few weeks ago. Picture, if you will, me sitting at my table, approached by a motherly-looking woman, a key constituent of my demographic. She, I was so sorry to hear you had been ill. Me, thank you for saying so. She, a cousin of mine had cancer. Oh, I am sorry to hear that. She, as a line of customers lengthened behind her. Yes, in his liver. Me, that's never good. Her, but it went away after the doctors had told him it was incurable. Well, that's what we all want to hear. She, with those further back in the line now showing signs of impatience. Yes, but then it came back, much worse than before. Me, oh, how dreadful. Her, and then he died. It was agonizing. Agonizing. Seemed to take him forever. Me, beginning to search for my words. Her, of course, he was a lifelong homosexual. Me, not quite finding the words and not wishing to sound stupid by echoing, of course. She and his whole immediate family disowned him. He died virtually alone. Me, well, I hardly know what to. She, anyway, I just wanted you to know that I understand exactly what you are going through. This was a surprisingly exhausting encounter, without which I could easily have done. It made me wonder if perhaps there was a room for a shorthand book of cancer etiquette. This would apply to surfacers. This would apply to sufferers, as well as to sympathizers. After all, I have hardly been reticent about my own malady, but nor do I walk around sporting a huge lapel button that reads, "Ask me about stage 4 metastasized esophageal cancer," and only about that. In truth, if you can't bring me news about that and that alone, and about what happens when lymph nodes and lung may be involved, I am not all that interested or all that knowledgeable. One almost develops a kind of elitism about the uniqueness of one's own personal disorder. So if your own first or second-hand tale is about some other organs, you might want to consider telling it sparingly. Or at least more selectively. This suggestion applies whether the story is intensely depressing or lowering to the spirit. See above, or whether it is intended to convey uplift and optimism. My grandmother was diagnosed with terminal melanoma of the G spot, and they just about gave up on her. but she hung in there and took huge doses of chemotherapy and radiation at the same time. And the last postcard we had from her at the top of the Mount Everest. Once again, your narrative may fail to grip if you haven't taken any care to find out how well or badly your audience member is faring or feeling. It's normally agreed that the question, "How are you?" doesn't put you on your oath to give a full or honest answer. So when asked these days, I tend to say something cryptic like, "A bit early to say." If it's the wonderful staff at my oncology clinic who inquire, I sometimes go so far as to respond, "I seem to have cancer today." Nobody wants to be told about the countless minor horrors and humiliations that become facts of life when your body turns from being a friend to being a foe, the boring switch from chronic constipation to its sudden dramatic opposite, the equally nasty double cross of feeling acute hunger while fearing even the scent of food, the absolute misery of gut-wringing nausea on an utterly empty stomach, or the pathetic discovery that hair loss extends to the disappearance of the follicles in your nostrils and thus to the childish and irritating phenomena of a permanently runny nose. Sorry, but you did ask. It's no fun to appreciate to the full the truth of the materialist proposition that I don't have a body, I am a body. But it's not really possible to adopt a stance of don't ask, don't tell either. Like its original, this is a prescription for hypocrisy and double standards. Friends and relatives obviously don't really have the option of not making kind inquiries. One way of trying to put them at their ease is to be as candid as possible and not to adopt any sort of euphemism or denial. The swiftest way of doing this is to note that the thing about stage 4 is that there is no such thing as stage 5. Quite rightly, some take me up on it. I recently had to accept that I wasn't going to be able to attend my niece's wedding in my old hometown and former university in Oxford. This depressed me for more than one reason, and an especially close friend inquired, "Is it that you're afraid you'll ever see England again?" As it happens, he was exactly right to ask, and it had been precisely that which had been bothering me. But I was unreasonably shocked by his bluntness. "I'll do the facing of the hard facts, thanks. Don't you be doing it too?" And yet I had absolutely invited the question. Telling someone else with deliberate realism that once I'd had a few more scans and treatments, I might be told by the doctors that things from now on could be mainly a matter of management. I again had the wind knocked out of me when she said, "Yes, I suppose a time comes when you have to consider letting go." How true and how crisp a summary of what I had just said myself. But again, there was an unreasonable urge to have a kind of monopoly on or a sort of veto over what was actually sayable. Cancer victimhood contains a permanent temptation to be self-centered and even solipsistic. So my proposed etiquette handbook would improve duties on me as well as upon those who say too much or too little in an attempt to cover the inevitable awkwardness in diplomatic relations between Tumor Town and its neighbors. If you want an instance of exactly how not to be an envoy from the former, I would offer you both the book and the video of the last lecture. It would be in bad taste to say that this, a pre-recorded farewell by the late Professor Randy Posh, had gone viral on the internet. But so it has. It should bear its own health warning. So sugary that you may need an insulin shot to withstand it. Posh used to work for Disney, and it shows. He includes a whole section in defense of cliche, not omitting. Other than that, Mr. Lincoln, how was the play? The words kid or childhood and dream are employed as if for the very first time. Anyone who uses childhood and dream in the same sentence usually gets my attention. Posh taught at Carnegie Mellon, but it's like the Dale Carnegie note that he likes to strike. Brick walls are there for a reason, to give us a chance to show how badly we want something. Of course, you don't have to read Posh's book, but many students and colleagues did have to attend the lecture, at which Posh did push-ups, showed home videos, mugged for the camera, and generally joshed his head off. It ought to be an offense to be excruciating and unfunny in circumstances where your audience is almost morally obliged to enthuse. This was as much an intrusion in its way as that of the relentless motherly prosecutor with whom I began. As the populations of Town and Wellville continue to swell to interact, there's a growing need for ground rules that prevent us from inflicting ourselves upon one another. End of chapter. Chapter 5. I have seen the moment of my greatness flicker, and I have seen the eternal footman hold my coat and snicker. And in short, I was afraid. T.S. Eliot, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Like so many of life's varieties of experiences, the novelty of a diagnosis of malignant cancer has a tendency to wear off. The thing begins to pull. The thing begins to pall, even to become banal. One can become quite used to the specter of the eternal footman, like some lethal old bore lurking in the hallway at the end of the evening, hoping for the chance to have a word. And I don't so much object to his holding my coat in that marked manner as if mutely reminding me that it's time to be on my way. No, it's the snickering that gets me down. On a much too regular basis, the disease serves me up with a testing special of the day, or a flavor of the month. It might be random sores and ulcers on the tongue or in the mouth, or why not a touch of peripheral neuropathy involving numb and chilly feet? Daily existence becomes a babyish thing, measured out not in Prufrock's coffee spoons, but in tiny doses of nourishment, accompanied by heartening noises from onlookers or solemn discussions of the operations of the digestive system, conducted with motherly strangers. On the less good days, I feel like the wooden-legged piglet belonging to a sadistically sentimental family that could bear to eat him only a chunk at a time, except that cancer isn't so considerate. Most despond-inducing and alarming of all, so far, was the moment when my voice suddenly rose to a childish or perhaps piglet-like piping squeak. It then began to register all over the place, from a gruff and husky whisper to a papery plaintive bleat, and at times it threatened, and now threatens daily, to disappear altogether. I had just returned from giving a couple of speeches in California where, with the help of morphine and adrenaline, I could still successfully project my utterances. When I made an attempt to hail a taxi outside my home and nothing happened, I stood frozen, like a silly cat that had abruptly lost its meow. I used to be able to stop a New York cab at 30 paces. I could also, without the help of a microphone, reach the back of a row of the gallery and of a crowded debating hall. And it may be nothing to boast about, but people tell me that if their radio or television was on, even in the next room, they could always pick out my tones and know that I was on too. Like health itself, the loss of such a thing can't be imagined until it occurs. It's in common with everybody else. I have played versions of the youthful. Which would you rather game? In which most usually it's debated whether blindness or deafness would be the most oppressive, but I don't ever recall speculating much about being struck dumb. In the American vernacular, to say, I'd really hate to be dumb, might be, in any case, draw another snicker. Deprivation of the ability to speak is more like an attack of impotence or the amputation of a part of the personality. To a great degree in public and private, I was my voice. All the rituals and etiquette of conversation, from clearing the throat in preparation for the telling of an extremely long and taxing joke, to, in younger days, trying to make my proposals more persuasive as I sank the tone by a strategic octave of shame, were innate and essential to me. I have never been able to sing, but I could once recite poetry and quote prose and was sometimes even asked to do so. And timing is everything. The exquisite moment when one can break in and cap a story, or turn a line for a laugh, or ridicule an opponent. I lived for moments like that. Now I want to enter a conversation. Now, if I want to enter a conversation, I have to attract attention in some other way and live with that awful fact that people are listening sympathetically. At least they don't have to pay attention for long. I can't keep it up and anyways can't stand to. When you fall ill, people send you CDs. Very often, in my experience, these are by Leonard Cohen. So I have recently learned a song entitled If It Be Your Will. It's a tiny bit saccharine, but it's beautifully rendered and it opens like this. If it be your will that I speak no more, and my voice be still as it was before. I find it's best not to listen to this late at night. Leonard Cohen is unimaginable without and indissoluble from his voice. I now doubt that I could be bothered or bear to hear that song done by anybody else. In some ways, I tell myself I could hobble along by communicating only in writing, but this is really only because of my age. If I had been robbed of my voice earlier, I doubt that I could ever have achieved much on this page. On the page, I owe a vast debt to Simon Hogarth of The Guardian, son of the author The Uses of Literacy, who about 35 years ago informed me that an article of mine was well argued but dull, and advised me to briskly write more like the way you talk. At the time, I was near speechless at the change of being boring and never thanked him, at the charge of being boring and never thanked him properly. But in time, I appreciate that my fear of self-indulgence and the personal pronoun was its own form of indulgence. To my writing classes, I used later to open by saying that anybody who could talk could also write. Having cheered them up with this easy to grasp ladder, I then replaced it with a huge and loathsome snake. How many people in this class would you say can talk? I mean, really talk. That had its duly woeful effect. I told them to read every composition aloud, preferably to a trusted friend. The rules are much the same. Avoid stock expression, like the plague, as William Safire used to say, and repetitions. Don't say that as a boy your grandmother used to read to you, unless at that stage of life she really was a boy, in which case you have probably thrown away a better intro. If something is worth hearing or listening to, it's very probably worth reading. So, this above all, find your own voice. The most satisfying compliment a reader can pay is to tell me that he or she feels personally addressed. Think of your own favorite authors and see if that isn't precisely one of the things that engages you, often at first without your noticing it. A good conversation is the only human equivalent, the realizing that decent points are being made and understood, that irony is in play and elaboration, and that a dull or obvious remark would be almost physically hurtful. This is how philosophy evolved in the symposium before philosophy was written down. And poetry began with the voice as its only player and the ear as its only recorder. Indeed, I don't know of any really good writer who was deaf either. How could one ever come, even with the clever signage of a good abde to appreciate the minuscule twinges and ecstasies of nuances that the well-tuned voice imparts? Henry James and Joseph Conrad actually dictated their later novels, which must count as one of the greatest vocal achievements of all time. Even though they might have benefited from hearing some passages read back to them, and Saul Bellow dictated much of Humboldt's gift. Without our corresponding feeling for the idiolect, the stamp on the way an individual actually talks, and therefore rights, we would be deprived of a whole continent of human sympathy and of its minor key pleasures such as mimicry and parody. More solemnly, all I have is a voice, wrote W.H. Auden in September 1st, 1939. His agonized attempt to comprehend and oppose the triumph of radical evil. Who can reach the deaf? He asked despairingly. Who can speak for the dumb? At about the same time, German Jewish future nobelist Nelly Sachs found that the apparition of Hitler had caused her to become literally speechless, robbed of her very voice by the stark negation of all values. Our own everyday idiom preserves the idea, however mildly. When a devoted public servant dies, the obituaries will often say that he was a voice for the unheard. From the human throat, terrible banes can also emerge, bawling, droning, whining, yelling, inciting the windiest militant trash, as Auden phrased in the same poem, and even snickering. It's the chance to pitch still, small voices against the torrent of babble and noise, the voice of wit and understatements, for which one yearns. All of the best recollections of wisdom and friendship, from Plato's Apology for Socrates to Boswell's Life of Jobson, resound with the spoken, unscripted moments of interplay and reason and speculation. In It's in engagements like this, in competition and comparison with others, that one can hope to hit upon the elusive magical mot juste. For me, to remember friendship is to recall those conversations that it seemed a sin to break off, the ones that made the sacrifice of the following day a trivial one. That was the way that Callimachus chose to remember his beloved Heraclitus, as adopted into English by William Corey. They told me, Heraclitus, they told me you were dead. They brought me bitter news to hear and bitter tears to shed. I wept when I remembered how often you and I had tired the sun with talking and sent him down the sky. Indeed, he rests his claim for his friend's immortality on the sweetness of his tones. Still are thy pleasant voices, thy nightingales awake. For death he taketh all away, but them he cannot take. Perhaps a little too much uplift in that closing line. In the medical literature, the vocal cord is a mere fold, a piece of gristle that strives to reach out and touch its twin, thus producing the possibility of sound effects. But I feel that there must be a deep relationship with the word chord, the resonant vibration that can stir memory, produce music, evoke love, bring tears, move crowds to pity, and mobs to passion. We may not be, as we used to boast, the only animals capable of speech, but we are the only ones who can deploy vocal communication for sheer pleasure and recreation, combining it with our two other boasts of reason and humor to produce higher syntheses. To lose this ability is to be deprived of an entire range of faculty. It is assuredly to die more than a little. My chief consolation in this year of living dyingly, has been the presence of friends. I can't eat or drink for pleasure anymore. So when they offer to come, it's only for the blessed chance to talk. Some of these comrades can easily fill a hall with paying customers avid to hear them. They are talkers with whom it's a privilege just to keep up. Now at least I can do the listening for free. Can they come and see me? Yes, but only in a way. So now every day I go to a waiting room and watch the awful news from Japan on cable TV, often closed captioned just to torture myself, and wait impatiently for a high dose of protons to be fired into my body at two-thirds the speed of light. What do I hope for? If not a cure, then a remission. And what do I want back? in the most beautiful apposition of the two simplest words in our language, freedom of speech. End of chapter 5.